This conference will now be recorded.
There we go. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Suchi Pathak and I am one of the co-founders of Aptology and the chief psychologist. I'm going to switch off my camera because I can get really animated and use my hands, and often that can distract people from my slides. But I'm really excited to talk to you today about what we do. We essentially align people and business goals using assisted intelligence. And so what I'll be taking you through today is the story behind Aptology, the current landscape and the problem that we solve, and then how we solve it. So I'll be jumping in and showing you the product. And as Nove said, I'd love any questions or comments that you have as they come to mind. I'd love this to be an interactive session, so please do go ahead, take yourself off mute when you want to ask a question. So just to give you the story behind Aptology, it was founded because we were trying to solve the age-old problem of trying to find the right people for the right roles. And the reason for that is fit to role is the key way of aligning people to organizational outcomes. So during this process, we wanted to find ways to kind of eliminate bias, because bias really gets in the way of organizations performing well, because people make the wrong decisions when bias and things like that creep into the process. So just to give a bit of my background, I'm a behavioral psychologist, and I worked in consulting and psychometrics. And so after being the head of psychology and research for about 10 years in a global assessment company, I kind of realized that the current way that assessment and consulting companies were trying to solve this problem just weren't working in the right way. The first is there was a lot of subjectivity still within that process. So defining of what good looks like tends to involve asking a lot of opinions from people and not necessarily utilizing data to find out why. And then the second reason is I found that with the assessment industry and the consulting industry, a lot of it is very heavily hiring focused. And if you're thinking about trying to make the right decisions across the employee life cycle, only using it hiring is a really big missed opportunity. And the reason for that is that's one part of the process. When you're making decisions based on promotion, succession planning, or career pathing, all those biases creep back into the process. And if you think about it and you go higher up the hierarchy of an organization, that people get less diverse because bias is generally creeping into that process. My other two co-founders came from the human capital management space, and they came from companies like PeopleSoft and Taleo. One of the co-founders was the chief CTO at Taleo, so he built a lot of their systems. And their frustration was that they felt that human capital management systems weren't quite meeting the mark in solving this problem of fit to role throughout the employee life cycle as well. And so we all kind of ended up getting together and starting the company. So the landscape right now is not very easy. It's pretty tough. And I love this Bersin Deloitte stat because it really highlights one of the reasons why. At the moment, there's 7.1 million open jobs at the moment and only 5.9 million people seeking employment. So if you think of that, that is a huge void. And so the problem becomes, how do we attract the right candidates, and how do we get the right candidates before someone else does? And then there's the other issue of, once we have them, how do we keep them? Not to paint too much of a gloomy picture, but the other thing that's happening right now is attrition is an all-time high, and that's costing the industry around 600 billion. But we know that 75% of attrition is preventable. And when we think of why people are leaving companies, it could be that they don't have the right fit to role, they haven't found the right experience for them, they're not happy in their current role, or it could be that they're just not performing. And so there's a whole myriad of things that are going on here. Now, companies are realizing that this is an issue. And the good news is CEOs are seeing people as the company's most valuable asset. So what happens now is they tend to be turning to CHROs for trying to solve the problem. And I love this Spencer Stewart quote, because it's saying that CEOs are now expecting CHROs to bring strong business acumen and an understanding of how the organization makes money and how that feeds into decision making. So that's amazing that they're really understanding where to look and how to utilize people. However, this kind of feels like a bit of a poison chalice for a CHRO, because performance isn't measured in an objective way throughout most of the organization. So it's really difficult to understand how to utilize your people to move the needle on organizational objectives. Now, the cost of doing this and getting it wrong is pretty harsh. So the impact is felt at every single stage of the employee life cycle. And if you're looking at these statistics, things like not having adequate diversity, if it's not tied to organizational objectives, people aren't really incentivized to do that. Ineffective hiring decisions means that can affect the bottom line and performance in companies. And then slow decision making and all that bureaucracy in processing can really hamper the CHRO's possibility of doing this. And so what we're trying to do in Aptology is really try to understand how we can move the needle on performance by utilizing the people that we have. It's not for a lack of trying that all these things are happening. $40 billion is being spent on HR technology and consulting at the moment. And as we're speaking to a lot of our clients, what we're finding is that these technologies can sometimes end up really highlighting process over the actual people that you're working with. Looking at efficiency rather than organizational outcomes. So making things a lot faster and a lot more efficient. But if you don't understand what good looks like in the role and what you're looking for, you could sometimes hire the wrong people faster. The other thing is that a lot of the information that are plugged into some of these systems are very one-dimensional. And what I mean by that is most people tend to look at things like education, experience, and interviews. Now, those factors are known to really contribute about 11% to why someone succeeds in a role. And some of the reasons why are education. People look for very specific schools that people have gone to, but is that really tied to if they're going to do well in the job? Education sometimes has a socioeconomic status attached to it. So people that go to really good colleges tend to come from more wealthy backgrounds, for example. So again, that's a biasing factor that can creep in. Experience, sometimes people assume that if you've done really, really well in a job that's very similar to yours in another company, that you're going to fit right in. But we've got clients that have shown that even if they get people that are direct competitors and they poach them, once they come into their organization, they're not working out. So why is that? And that's what we try to do, is uncover why that's the case. And then if we're talking about bias, interviewing is one of the biggest sources of bias. People tend to make up their mind about someone very quickly. And from a CHRO point of view or a talent acquisition point of view, we want it to be a really standardized process. We want it to be fair. We want to ask the right questions. And with all the best will in the world, I think we all have a couple of horror stories about when someone asks a really awkward question at interview. And I tend to find in my experience of working with clients for 10 years across these things and really trying to instill best practices, that interview questions that look into things like behavior are the most awkward. Couple of examples that I've heard recently are, if you were planning a party, what theme would it be? The candidate experience on that one is awful because they're not being asked a question that's specific to the role. They feel like there's a lot of bias in the answer because they don't know what that person would particularly say. And so it can lead to a really disastrous consequence. And whether the interviewer likes or dislikes that answer, does it relate to if that person's going to do well in the job? So what really does move the needle on if someone is going to be successful in a job is things underneath the surface. So things like coachability, emotional intelligence, temperament, etc. Those are the things that really do highlight whether someone fits with your company, fits in the role, and has the right behavioral alignment that the role needs in order to do the job. And then you've got that old adage, which is you hire for skills and you fire for behavior. And through speaking to a lot of our clients, that is exactly what they've got going on right now. The other thing, as it relates to when people are trying to assess what good looks like, there's a lot of missing information that people don't necessarily look into because it's not visible. And so you really need a system and data to really understand the whole overall job that you're actually trying to fit people into. And so you want to consider things like the role in terms of the performance targets, the job function, what they're required to do. But you also want to consider what environment that role fits in. So from one company to another, a team could be very different. The product and the product complexity could be very different. The people that they're selling to could be different. Are people considering all of these things when they're looking at who they're trying to bring into the company or how to actually develop someone that's already there? And then the last component is really doing a deep dive into the individual. So how do we get that data and how do we utilize data to understand what's really going on underneath the surface? So this might sound like we come in and do a 2 or 3 week consulting period with you. We don't. The way that we do it is we use behavioral data and machine learning. So the first step is to collect the overall team's behavioral blueprint. And that's done by a 15 to 20-minute behavioral survey that looks at personality, behavior, and emotional intelligence. The survey is really fast to do. We're very keen on candidate experience. And so it's a really easy survey with a good UI, and people tend to enjoy doing it. Once we have the behavioral blueprint of your entire team, we then match it with objective performance metrics. And the reason that we do that is that tends to decrease the amount of bias that's in that process of really defining what good looks like. And so when you then tie behavioral information with performance information for the overall team, what you start to understand is that there's so many data points that you can utilize. There's around 50 million that we use in our machine learning models. And we use that to create what we would call a success profile. And a success profile really differentiates the key behaviors that differentiate your top performers from your bottom performers. So to make a distinction between some other kind of tools out there, a lot of them will say to you, give us your top performers and we will tell you what's common in them. If you don't look at everyone else in the role, you can't tell really what's different with your top performers to your bottom performers. With that methodology, you could end up finding out that what you found in your top performers is the same as your bottom performers. What we do is really try to find out what teases apart that difference between people. And then once you have the success profile, it just comes down to matching. So you have the individual, you match them against the success profile, and we can give you the fit score. And the most important thing is we do this, but we do this at scale. We do this using built-in algorithms and a SaaS platform, so everything is immediately visible. You're not having someone doing that analysis for you or a consultant kind of taking you through each individual profile. And the way that we do that is that, the reason that we do that is that we're consistent, we're predictable. So our predictive models have about 80+ predictability, whether someone's going to meet or exceed their targets in a given role. And for me, what's really important is we're doing it in a bias-free way. And so a lot of people would see an AI system as potentially taking away the human element. But what we did was we built in measures to make sure that we're not introducing bias into that system. And so that survey that I talked to you about basically measures whether someone is going to be biased against their age, gender, socioeconomic status, or their ethnicity. And so we worked with Cambridge University to make sure that every single question in our survey didn't pose males and females in a different light, or people of different genders or ethnicities. We wanted to make sure that the information that we plugged in was as clean as possible from the start. And so before I show you exactly what a success profile would look like and how we can use it in practice, I just want to give you a really good example that we have of how you tie fit to role to an organizational outcome. So this is one of the clients that's currently working with us. So they're a global technology company, and we worked to create a model for their account executive role. And once we had this model, a lot of hiring managers were just kept hiring people because they were in a period of high growth, and they were hiring people anyway. What we were able to do is then retrospectively say, how would we have rated these people that are coming into the role when we match them against the profile? And so it was a great way for us to kind of A/B test what we're doing. What we found was when people first joined the company, and this was an account exec role, that they ramped faster, they progressed their pipeline faster, and then their actual revenue attainment was higher. And so just to go into a little bit of detail, what they found with early pipeline progression was that they generated 1.4 times more annual contract value than the people that we would have classed as mismatches through our SaaS platform. The second thing is, as they were building their pipeline, they realized that the number of deals that they progressed was 2.7 times more for the people that were really closely aligned to the job rather than people that had the gaps to the role. And the annual contract value, they progressed 3.3 times later stage pipeline in annual contract value. But really, the proof was in the pudding, which was the annual revenue attainment was 2.7 times more for people that were great matches to the profile than people that we deemed to be mismatches and we would have flagged on our system. And so the company put this into place. And once we showed them that these were their return on investment metrics, they started to put a policy in place that if any manager wanted to hire what we would deem a mismatch, they had to get the VP's approval. Because they just realized that they were going into the risk zone if they were looking at someone who had huge gaps in their profile as opposed to someone that was a great match. So I'm going to show you exactly how it works, but I was wondering if anyone had any questions at this point about anything that I've discussed.
So Sushi, I always have questions, but let me, shall we say, defer to the crowd first. Anyone have any particular questions or observations they want to share? Okay, well, so let me ask it from a perspective, and I see this quite often. So job descriptions are really the basis for job postings. And what I see is job descriptions they're all over the board, if you will. Do you believe that your matching from a job description is sufficient, or some firms are actually moving to a more competency-based, skills, experience, and competencies? I want to see these competencies in this job. What do you find to be preferable? What do you find to be, if you will, the less preferable? And how can we move that needle a little bit in terms of using your product in the most appropriate fashion, if you will?
So that's a great question, and it's actually something that we're finding that our clients are using a lot more to demystify really what they're looking for, because job descriptions are often not necessarily reflective of what the job is. They don't tend to mention some of the downsides of the job, which I think is a good realistic preview. But the way that we actually find out what good looks like for the role isn't by using job descriptions. We actually use data. So we're using behavioral data of everyone in the current team, and then we're matching it with objective performance metrics to really find which attributes have the strongest signal when you're trying to differentiate what top performers have that bottom performers don't have, or vice versa. And so it might be a good idea for me to show you what a success profile looks like to kind of show what I'm saying. Can everyone see, can you see the screen now that it should say success profile for account executives?
Yes.
Okay. So this is what a success profile would look like. So after taking the behavioral blueprint of the team and matching it with performance metrics, the machine learning algorithms will tease out which particular behaviors top performers have that bottom performers don't have, or what the differences are. And so for this success profile for account executives, what we found using the data actually is that the top performers were more emotionally perceptive, meaning they could read a room a lot faster, they could understand a buying signal, they could understand who the key decision maker was in a room if it wasn't clear. And bottom performers really struggled with this. So they may misread how someone feels about a situation, or not really pick up if someone's confused or frustrated. And therefore, what they're doing is missing really key buying signals from this perspective. The second one is that we found is that top performers are really curious to learn. And because this is a very complex product, what we found that being curious to learn was a really beneficial thing because they really dug into the product itself. They asked all the right questions of clients, and bottom performers were asking maybe 1 or 2 questions or digging into a bit of information, but not so far. So they got caught out quite a lot after when we spoke to the client. They said, yeah, actually, we're seeing this. The other thing is that top performers were very disciplined because it was a long sales cycle. And so they really needed to plan ahead and not just work in the moment. And bottom performers were kind of just working off the fly. So they weren't really strategizing about how to move their deals through the pipeline and make them progressive. Now, what's interesting, Nove, is to your point, a lot of people would say in a job description that, you need broad brush labels of people that are gregarious, for example. That's assuming that the higher level of gregariousness that you have, the better you are for a job. And with our methodology and with our AI system, what we find is that we look for the optimal zone. So socially initiating or gregariousness is a really good example. Here, the top performers actually need to be moderately socially initiating. And the derailer in the job is when people are too gregarious. I think we've all been sold to by people who are way too talkative and don't listen to us. And so what we found was top performers generally had this level of this trait where it was in the middle. So they were able to listen and speak in equal proportion, and bottom performers, it was derailing them.
Got you. So that kind of begs a little bit of a question. What kind of statistical, basis would you need to look at a team? I mean, is there a particular minimum or maximum you want to look at? Probably the more is better, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm a psychologist, so I'm just greedy about data. But my ideal to be able to build a model, we need around 50 people in a given role, because that really gives us enough data points to understand the differentiation between their performance metrics. And so that's around it, about 50 people in a given role. And, people, roles that have performance targets that kind of reflect what good looks like within the role.
And I'll ask one last quick question. Being in the SaaS world the way you are, that the opportunity to look at, let's say, a job like an account executive role, can you potentially look at a smaller sample size? Maybe I only have 10 salespeople, executives, that you could look at the industry I'm in, possibly, if you will, size of company or revenues or something like that, and give me a kind of a pseudo team look to, trying to assess what's a good account executive as a hire coming in. In other words, it's not my data that you're looking at, but you're giving me some examples, or is that something on the roadmap?
So that is something that we can do based on our on the data that we've collected. So we actually, when we were building the company, we acquired 20 years of behavioral data and it had performance attributed to it. And so we have kind of overall trends that we find within specific roles, and we kind of vector it, like you said. So we vector it because sales in a startup is very different to sales in a large scale enterprise company, and so we tend to try to vector it when people can't. But yeah, people can use us in that way. But if people really want a bespoke profile for what works for their particular team, the way to get it would be around 50 people in a team.
Gotcha. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? If not, we'll let you go back to the demonstration, please. Okay.
Okay, great. So just one more point about your job description, which we found time and time again when we're speaking to clients. The job descriptions are obviously something that you need to do when you're building any kind of job requirement profile. But what this tends to do is internally, it can really help to understand what good looks like within the role. And what we find is to create a common language between talent acquisition and the recruiter and the hiring manager. And so one of our investors, actually, we were talking about this and she gave a really funny story. A lot of times people tend to use the words like, we want someone that is a rock star. We want someone that's a ninja. And I've seen that a lot of times in job descriptions. And she worked for Facebook. So she worked in talent acquisition for Facebook and ran engineering there. she was being told by everyone, you know, Jocelyn, we need more rock stars, we need more rock stars. So every time she asked somebody what a rock star was, they gave a different definition. And in the end, she had to go to Mark Zuckerberg himself and say, please tell me what you mean by a rock star who's an engineer. And he told her it's someone that can really take the technical information that they're getting, but really understand what the organization needs and how to move that forward and really find a way to make it palatable and make people understand it. And she said, right, now I have this information, I can now go and look for what this person is. And labels are used so much in this process when we're trying to find right people. And so rather than saying a rock star, why don't we break it down into behavioral descriptions that are actually tenable, people understand them, and they can start to understand what good looks like. The other horror stories we tend to hear is people in talent acquisition hear all the time, I need more people like Joe Bloggs. And so they have to understand who he is and why that person's a good fit. And then they're just trying to replicate this. But that person may have identified Joe Bloggs because they really like them. It might not be because they're a good performer. So using that data behind the scenes and really understanding the behavioral profile in an objective way can really start to be able to tie it to organizational performance.
So I apologize, Sushi, but you've now raised one more quick question. So certainly with an account executive, the obvious impact to the organization may be the sales figures or sales that the person has generated as a metric, saying that's the successful profile. How do I take, let's say, somebody who's in a manufacturing world, running a plant machine or something? How does that come about? What kind of sense of measurement must that company need for this to work very well? Or is there a sense? Maybe I'm missing something there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for customer facing roles, it like you said, things like percentage of quota achieved. We're working with call centers now as well, but you know, revenue attainment, etc. I think it's a lot easier to find objective metrics within those customer facing roles. For other roles, you know, and we are being, you know, we work primarily with customer facing roles, but we get pulled straight away into sales leadership, for example, which is less tangible in terms of the metrics. Other roles, it depends on what good looks like. So it could be that, you know, for certain roles, it's like the number of errors made or the overall performance metrics that they measure. If they've got a large capabilities project, is there something there that, you know, they're measuring people against every 6 months time that we could look at? You know, it's always better to get performance data from at least multiple sources tied to an individual. So maybe if it's 180 or 360, it varies. But we find, you know, this is one of the reasons we started with customer facing roles, is that it's a lot easier to get those performance metrics.
Right.
But, you know, me saying that, there are a few companies that have said, yeah, we don't believe in our own metrics when it comes to customer facing. And when it comes to that, you know, we can work with them, and we usually find something that actually does tie back to performance that sometimes they don't see. We see everything in terms of data. So, you know, we could actually work to help them identify that.
Well, and it just strikes me too that as people continue to use Aptology as their kind of screening device and the matching to the team, they will get much better because they will be hiring people and they will maybe see that the metrics they've been looking at are wrong, if you will, or not quite as indicative as what you're seeing when you do this team profile and such. I think there's a lot of benefit to having over time using the same product and refining that, if you will. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where, you know, machine learning really does kick in. The more data refreshes that we get from clients, that's where the models start to learn. And actually, these profiles evolve as the job evolves. And so what you'll tend to find over time is maybe some of these attributes may move. You may find a new attribute coming in because they're now picking up, it's picking up the new signals that are required for the role. The other thing I would say is that this does tend to really specialize into different types of different roles as well. So just to keep using sales as an example, we found with more transactional sales, the socially initiating scores can actually flip, where the top performers need to be a lot more frequently gregarious. and the bottom performers aren't gregarious enough. Because if you think about the volume of the transactions and the amount of people they're speaking to, you need to keep that social energy. And so there's a misnomer sometimes when you're looking at, quote, just salespeople, that you think, oh, this guy's really interpersonal. But only when you really take a behavioral survey and really understand the optimal zones do you know where they fit.
Hi, Sushi. This is Roscoe here. I'm going a little bit more back into the weeds, and if I'm a little bit out of line here, just let me know. So, you know, this is a success profile of an individual, but, you know, most of us have HCM systems like Workday, SAP SuccessFactors, those kind of things that have, you know, job descriptions, job class, job profile, all those kind of things. Is that information able to be sort of integrated via an API or some other mechanism into the Aptology?
So at the moment, our clients are using us a little bit into their recruiting funnel. So they tend to use us kind of after the first or second stage interview. So not that many people are using us on an API basis, but it's definitely something that we're working on integrating into for sure. And actually the reason for that is we can pull lots of metrics that way, like you mentioned.
All right, no, thank you.
But just to clarify, this is a success profile of what good looks like for the overall team. And what I'll show you is that how we use this to compare individuals. Quick thing about this as well is that the more people we speak to and the more companies that we work with, they want to bring in an element of their team culture, and we can't pretend it doesn't exist because it's a really key metric that people tend to use within their company. So one of the things that we will do is by using the data, we will see if there's any commonalities across the entire team that we see that could be a cultural indicator. So for this role, we found people were moderately assertive and they were quite resilient within the role. When we spoke to the company and said, look, this is what the data has found, they said, actually, this is a minimum standard to even be in this role. And then what we're doing is we're now working with a company and they're saying, look, there's a couple of things that we would embed into our culture. And we've found that people that come, they do a good job, but they break a lot of glass along the way. So we do want a secondary check to see if they fit to our culture. And so we can insert attributes here that really relate to an organization's specific culture as well, because that does matter for team cohesiveness. And I'll show you how that can be used as a secondary check in a second. So once you have the success profile, you can run your entire team through this. And so as I mentioned at the beginning, we're really keen of making sure that this information is utilized across the whole employee life cycle, not just at recruiting. And so we put everyone in a matrix. So this is everyone within a current team. And where you can see numbers is just where there's like a couple of people or 3 people that are staggered in one place. Oh, excuse me. And so we plot everyone according to their fit score, so their alignment to that success profile that I just showed you, as well as their actual performance metrics that we've got from the organization that we use to build the model. And along the side here, we'll also plot people who have joined the company but haven't been there long enough that it's fair that you're looking at performance for them. So we'll just plot them against the potential axes, but not the actual performance. And managers and our clients, when they look at this, it really helps them to get a macro view about what's going on with their team and to really understand what they need to do in terms of their business planning. So these 4 boxes help you to understand who is a really high fit to the profile. So their behavior is really closely aligned to what good looks like in the role and who's currently performing for you. And so these group here, we would say nurture them. They're doing really well for you. They've got a really high alignment for their profile. Do what you can to maybe keep them. Think about incentivizing them. In difficult economic times, and we may or may not be slipping further into that, people may say, okay, well, there have to be a hiring freeze. If that's the case, you would want to know in your organization who's likely to carry on performing well and who is objectively performing well for you right now. The other thing is we look at the people that have a really high fit to the role, but for some reason they're not performing. And this could be for a number of reasons. So in a customer-facing role, it could be that they walked into a really bad territory, or they were just given really a bad client base. we found, speaking to clients, that actually some of these cluster around certain managers. So you can change the view from an overall team to specific managers as well. And so this is really interesting because these people may need some hard skills training, or they may need a little bit more experience, but the soft skills that they've got are completely aligned. Then you have the people here who we would call outliers. And they're the people that our models can't figure out why they work. And often when we speak to clients, they can't figure it out either. So these people might break some glass along the way, or they may have just been walked into a really good project or territory or client base. And we would say monitor these people, because if something changes in the role, we don't know how they're going to react, because their general fit to the role isn't as good as the people up here. And this is the really interesting part. So this is where, if you're a CHRO or talent acquisition, this starts to become really interesting. So you're looking here at people that are sort of performing okay, and they're close to being aligned to the profile. And the first thing that we would say is, let's find out what's going on behind the scenes. So with Trevor here, we know that his strengths and where he aligns to the profile is that he's quite curious, he's quite socially initiating, and just in the right amounts that we need him to be. But the areas to develop is that he's not emotionally perceptive enough. And we show where he fits against the actual profile. And there, what you can see is, okay, so we know how far this gap is. We can tell you which the gaps are. And then we can give you development tips of how to actually develop Trevor into behaving more like the role, the behavior that we want him to do, that we know is successful for the role. So then you have the people here that you can start to think about coaching and developing. And we're finding with a lot of our clients that sales enablement are really looking at this. And they're saying, actually, if 20% of our people need training in being emotionally perceptive, let's put a training course together so that we actually, nip this in the bud when people first join us. The other thing is that you have people here and they're not performing for you, and they may not have been performing for a consistent amount of time. And the fit to the role isn't as aligned as the people up here. And so they've got significant gaps to their profile. So what we say here is that you can do a couple of things. You can see if there's an opportunity to really develop this person, but that takes quite a lot of work. But if we build multiple success profiles for you, you can then compare people to other jobs within your company now. And what you'll see in some instances is that these dots will float to the top. Because just if you're not a good fit in one role, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a bad fit in another role. So you could be a great match to another role out there. And this is where talent acquisition are like kids in a candy shop when you're looking at this role, because they can then pull candidates from the organization currently that are not going to work out, and they're not paying recruiting costs. The onboarding time is a lot faster because they already know about your company, your culture, your product, what you do. And so now what you can do is really make sure that these people here, you find the best roles for them within your organization.
So Sushi, this is Nov again. I love what you said in that lower left box. Do you see any of your clients at this point in time churning through their workforce to do exactly that? To me, this is kind of a combination of fit to current job, career development potential, or in some cases, or training ability, or in some cases, maybe out.
Yeah, agreed. And I think when people are looking to, right size their business or understand what's going on, then they can use this as an initial diagnostic tool just to understand, what are the distribution of people that are performing and not performing, or a great match or a mismatch to the role. We've got another client at the moment, so using us for exactly that. So they're now thinking, with this economic downturn potentially, if we're going to freeze hiring, what do we do? How do we consolidate the people that we currently have? Let's take a macro look. The other use case for this is a merger or an acquisition. So if you're combining two teams together, what's going on with that team, and who have I got that I should really hold on to, and who do I need to develop?
Good point. Very nice. Thank you.
So I've just shown you kind of how you can utilize this particular board. One more thing I would say is we were going in, and we clients tend to meet us, you know, if they're doing just before a QBR, to say, look, this is how we're using the dashboard. Have you got any tips for us? And we went in just to see a client before one of their quarterly business reviews, and we were geeking out over the data behind the scenes. And we said to them, you know, did you know that 10% of people in your mid-market role are actually a great match for your enterprise role? And the client turned around and said, oh, thank goodness that you said that, because we're really struggling to fill enterprise positions. And we said, okay, well, these are the people, they're really closely aligned to the enterprise role. So well, how about, you know, how difficult do you find it to recruit to a mid-market role? And they said, oh no, that's a lot easier. So we said, well, this could potentially be a feeder position, right? So you're getting people in your mid-market that are great matches to your enterprise role. And then it's easier to find people to backfill the mid-market vacancies. And the other thing that the client said was, this is a relief, because the people in mid-market, once they've ramped, which is 18 months, 18 to 24 months after that, they tend to get bored and leave. And we said, well, this could be seen as a promotion. And they said, exactly, this is actually going to really help us to retain some of the talent that we really like, but we know they're getting bored and we can't add more responsibility to their current role. And so internal mobility is a really big play here, and we really want to encourage that as much as possible. So once you run all of your people through this role, you may identify that you may need to backfill some positions. And so now you can look at all your candidates compared to the success profile as well. And this is just an example of all the different success profiles that you could have and which candidates stack up well to all of these. And so, you know, going back to that viewpoint of these could be internal or external candidates, we could be turning around to people now and saying, you know, Gloria, did you know that you're a great match to another role that maybe you weren't aware of? Let's just say Gloria was an external candidate and she came highly recommended. One of the things that you can do is to understand where she may have gaps. So Gloria is not disciplined enough. But what we'll do is we'll provide you with specific interview questions to address that. And so going back to my earlier point about these kind of nightmarish interview scenarios, what this can start to do is to give you predetermined interview questions that really dig deep into what's going on behind that, to see if Gloria does have any coping mechanisms for the fact that she's not very disciplined. And so hiring managers, talent acquisition recruiters can all have these questions. And so everyone gets the same experience of going through a recruitment process. And then the team culture fit, we can then tell you if someone is more assertive than the team. And if that's a problem, what you could do about it is we'll give you more interview questions to probe that. We found with some clients that if someone is more assertive than the team, it may be that assertiveness is something they want more of. And so they will then say, you know, actually, we like this. We want someone more assertive because the role is changing. And so, you know, we want this to be used as decision support as opposed to an in-out screening process. And that's where people are really finding us useful. Recruiters are finding this as a really great way to justify and to hiring managers why they should or shouldn't be taking their recommendations. Whereas before, they haven't been able to necessarily articulate why that is in a consistent way. And so we're finding that this is really helping to solve that problem. And ultimately, it's giving people data to back up what they're saying. And that's kind of reducing that bias across the board as well. Candidate and incumbent experience is very important to us. And so for each individual, we will give them a work style portrait that doesn't show them about their fit to role, but it gives them a general indication of their natural behavioral style compared to the working population. And so people really like receiving this because it gives them an insight into them. It gives you a bit of information about what you can do with this. So it starts to kind of increase their self-awareness as they go along as well.
So Sushi, do you mind me asking very quickly, is that an available thing that you see your clients passing out to candidates?
Yeah, so people give it to, and people are very keen to give it to incumbents as part of the initial profile building because they find it really motivational. People love to receive it back. And actually people are sending this to candidates because I think people are recognizing more that a candidate could end up being your future client or a future partner, and they want the candidate to get something out of the process as well.
I think it's a beautiful situation. The black hole of recruiting just got closed up by doing that. Do you mind if I ask? I seem to be asking all the questions, so folks, please feel free to jump in and tell Nova to please be quiet. Curious about those clients that are using your tool. Do they, or have you done a little bit of testing on, hey, you passed on these resumes before? If I run them back through Aptology, you probably missed a couple people you should have hired.
So that's really interesting because that's happened. So rather than looking at resumes, what people what people are doing are, when they're seeing, especially when I showed you the manager dashboard and the people that hadn't ramped, we put them against the side. They start to look at the people that haven't ramped yet and are a mismatch to the profile. And because the manager dashboard is so compelling, it really does blow that kind of subjectivity out of the water. One of the things that it tends to do is it tends to challenge their understanding of, oh, maybe I have got some of these wrong. So they have started to open up, okay, who did we discard? And let's ask them to run them through the survey.
Yeah.
Because that is now reopening it. The other thing that's interesting is, oh, sorry, I've got myself bad internet connection here. The other thing that's interesting is when people are looking at this team, it really does highlight where people have bias. So we had the head of HR on a call, and we had the VP of sales. And the VP of sales looked at someone here and said, I don't believe this. This person is amazing as a performer. And we kind of all were a bit shocked because we're looking at his performance levels over here. We're thinking, I don't know if that's the case. And luckily the head of HR said, why would you say he's a good performer? He hasn't sold beep. I'm not going to repeat that word. And the VP of sales turned around and said, well, he's really enthusiastic. And this is why some people get promoted and some people don't in an unfair world, right? So we just want to try to really help people to understand what's going on behind the scenes. The other interesting thing that can be teased apart with our data, and I think it's a question that you asked earlier, Nov, is we've found a few times that people may give us a metric. And when we try and build a model, we think, this is interesting. Some of this data doesn't quite work out. And because they give us multiple metrics, we'll compare them against it. What we found with a couple of clients is that there's actually two paths to success to a given role. And so one of our clients just gave us pure hard revenue numbers. And then, as a side thought, they gave us their customer retention numbers. And so we looked at the pure hard revenue numbers first, and the data science team ran it through the model and said, okay, wait, something funky is going on here. And we said, oh, they sent us more information. So then they combined the two and they ran it through. And what they found was there were two distinct styles within this given team, that this client was just whitewashing as one team. They said, we said to them, look, there's some people that have really high revenue and they look like this. This is their behavioral profile. But the other people who have really great customer relationships, they have a different profile. And so which one of these two are you looking for? So now what they've got is they've got a metric up here that they can switch between both of those, because both parts are important, and the data helped us to uncover that.
I love that. Very cool. So I'm looking at time for us to take a hard look on this feedback. I know I certainly always have feedback, but let me please open it up to the group as a whole, and then certainly I'm willing to stay a little bit longer if you wish, Susie, about anyone who wants to ask further questions. But how about some feedback to Sushi in the group? Anyone? You can get off.
This is Roscoe again. I'm going back. This is Roscoe again. I'm going back to integration. So, if you've got a candidate that goes through and you've got the top 3 or 4 that are there, I'm going back to the API sort of feed. Is there a way you can pass that information back into your HCM or your recruiting system, that you don't have to re-enter something or do something different? You can maybe trigger a next step out of the other top 4 that you've picked out of your application here.
We're currently working on that, Roscoe. So there's a lot of people that are now using us across multiple roles, and they don't want to use a couple of different systems. So we are looking at ways to integrate. Currently, we're not, but we're looking at doing that.
Yeah, that's kind of the key for the future. Don't disturb my framework. Just include you into my process. Yeah, you're right on. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking I'm thinking from an end-to-end perspective. Now you've got your applicant tracking system, and you might pull a couple of people out of there into here to do the evaluation. And then once the evaluation is done, you're going to pick your top 4, 5, or 6, and you want to move them on in the process. So you want some sort of feedback into your ATS and then into your recruiting system and HCM application going forward, right? So.
Yeah, so it's visible to all. You know, we're working on it at the moment, Roscoe. I'd love to reach out to you if you wanted to be our beta tester.
There we go. Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you have any pilot plans or beta situations that you'd like to offer to this crowd? And it'll get recorded, so anyone who listens can also contact me, and we'll put them in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody's interested in getting involved in running a project or beta testing with us, then please do get in contact, and we will reach out to you once we are in that position to be able to do that.
Outstanding. Any further comments? I certainly don't want to close this by leaving anyone out. Any comments from the audience?
Yeah, Suchi, hi, this is Melissa. This is fantastic. Thank you for sharing it with us today. My question for you is, when you bring humans together in any kind of dynamic, things change and evolve over time because we are humans and we're not static beings. Mm-hmm. How do you account for that change over time? A very specific example, the manager of the team changes, and anytime you have a new manager, the team culture or team dynamic can change with a new manager, different expectations, different personality style, different leadership style. Do you go back then and, I'll say, reassess to understand changes over time?
So great question, and we do take data refreshes periodically from people, and it depends on the client. So some people will give it to us. If it's sales, they'll say, oh, here's our quarterly figures, etc. Then this is, and then other people may say, oh, you know, we'll give you a data refresh every 6 months. We're really keen to get that information because we can start to pick up different signals that are actually working for the team now as opposed to before. And so over time, you may find that, well, with maybe a manager change and then they have a KPI change, or they start to reset how people look at KPIs, we may start to see different signals coming into play. The other thing that's happened with us is when new managers come into the team, after they look at this manager dashboard and they look at the success profile and the baselines, that cultural element, they may say, you know, actually now we're moving this so that we'd like to have a secondary check on the following attributes. So a really large technology company that we're working with at the moment, it's very interesting because they've said people are doing really well, but we think we need to reset our quota. And also what we want people to do is to be a lot more consultative than they have done at the moment, because up until now the product has sold itself. And now we're realizing there's a lot more. And so when we get that refresh of data, that machine learning algorithm will kick in and say, oh, look, you know, there's actually a new attribute now that's in addition to what you had already, looking like it's differentiating your top performers to your bottom performers.
That's a great question, Melissa. And actually, it always, I put it this way, the really good questions generate more questions. So, Suchi, from the perspective along the lines of what Melissa's just asked for, have you had any of your clients looking at the group of managers, which one of the metrics would be the cohesiveness of the group they manage, retention rates, maybe performance of the group as a whole, and using that to figure out what group I should be managing, or even being a manager, period. In other words, let's take this up a level.
We get asked about management straight away. After we tend to build a profile for sales, the next question is, okay, so now we're consolidating our sales team and we understand who's a great performer and why. Have we got the right managers to make sure that we keep that they're making the right decisions? And so looking at team performance is something that we could do as well. And it's a really good way for companies to take a look, an oversight about what their managers are doing as well. A lot of companies are concerned that managers don't take accountability for their team's performance. And so they are really keen to roll this out to the manager level to say, okay, we're telling you why this person isn't actually performing. We've got the coaching tips and development tips there. Sales enablement now is working with you to design programs. This is down to you now, right? So it's really helping managers to, and it's empowering them at the end of the day. But from the organization's point of view, in some cases, they feel like they're holding them accountable.
Yeah, which is a good idea. And I keep hearing the cry that the next thing behind the talent, the lack of talent, is the lack of leadership.
Yeah.
And so the promotion of somebody who's a great salesperson to be the manager is not always the smartest move. So no, I like that, the idea that this has extensibility beyond, as you've just shown it, to lots of different tiers of the organization. Any other comments? I do have one other perspective, more of a question than an observation, but I have to say again, Sushi, every time I see this, I get more insights, more excitement, and if you will, a perspective that you're sitting on a very, very nice tool to be used properly. And that's the big question. How do we use that properly? You know, we can't. I keep people going to artificial intelligence, whatever, saying it's got my answer, so I'm going to just follow the answer. There's lots of questions about whether you're looking at the right things and such, but you've got a very good mechanism in place here through the tool to be able to do that continually, refining. So I'm curious, and you know, it's certainly the coronavirus and everything else that's going on about the idea of remote worker. Could I, as an attribute, look at the behaviors of what is the appropriate behaviors for a remote worker in a job and put that on top of this to, in a sense, create an eligibility for whether or not you're a good remote worker?
It's really interesting you can say that, because one of the early models that we built was for enterprise sales execs, but it was for a medical devices company. And when we looked at the gregariousness score, it was a lot lower than what I showed you on this example. And we kind of scratched our heads and thought, what's happening here? Those people spent 80% of their day on the road, of their work day on the road, driving from one place to another. And so the only interactions they had was with their clients. They didn't interact with their team. They didn't have, their team meetings were virtual and not very frequent. And actually the people that coped in that job, because that's a tough job to do, actually had lower levels of gregariousness. They ramped it up whenever they spoke to a client, but they liked their own time. And so to answer your question, yeah, it can definitely pick up the environment that you work in as well. You don't want to put someone that doesn't like to be, you know, doesn't get their energy from other people in a huge crowded office where they're being drawn out all the time. That can lead to burnout. So it's really interesting what the data actually picks up when we're looking at it behind the scenes as well.
Yeah, I would encourage you to perhaps write a blog.
Yeah, I might do actually. It's kind of
I think, in all honesty, I think you've got the background, certainly in the data that supports this, and the tool does, that really could be a nice perspective to share at this time. Any other questions, comments, folks? Again, I always appreciate the support of the Technology Review Council for attending, taking the time out. Sushi, I appreciate you personally and your tool, absolutely. And we'll look forward. And as you continue to grow in that, we would love to invite you back at some point in the future with great success stories, I'm sure.
That would be great. And, you know, thanks everyone for being in this group. If there's any feedback that maybe, you know, you think of later or you didn't want to share in front of the group, good or bad, I'd love to hear it. So please do get in touch. My details, I'm pretty sure Nov can send them out.
I certainly do. Yeah. In fact, just, you know, folks, just shoot it over to me. I guarantee you that Sushi will get them directly. Shall we say unadulterated? But the feedback is always very, very valuable. So again, thank you all very much. Enjoy. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.